Here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go.
This is kind
Hey,
of
Rich, are we live? I think we just lost him, didn't we?
Oh my gosh, hysterical timing. So
I think we're live though. Welcome everybody.
Yeah, we are. Welcome, folks.
Hilarious.
Wakanda is having some network issues, and so I'm sure he'll be back to join us at some point. But yeah, we're here today to talk about DevPod, an open source project that launched just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, this is hilarious. He just told us about the power outages in his region, and it may affect the stream. And he's like, just keep going. But we didn't expect him to cut off right when we got live. That
For
is
sure.
hilarious. Well, I guess it's just the two of us for now. Hopefully he'll be able to join us back in a couple of minutes.
Yeah,
I
for
guess
sure.
we can get started.
I'm sure he'll come back. But yeah, why don't we start off, Lucas, with you just telling us kind of at a high level what DevPod is about?
Yeah, I think the core idea of DevPod is essentially to create reproducible dev environments in any infrastructure and any environment. Oh, Lakanda, yeah, you're back. Can you hear us? I guess it's still a little delayed. Yeah,
I can hear you loud and clear. Am I coming through just fine?
Oh, perfect, great. Rich has kicked off the stream a little bit. I was just diving into what DevPod's about. We're trying to create reproducible dev environments. We're using the dev container JSON standard, which is really, really exciting. So it's an open standard that Microsoft/GitHub started working on. They're using it for code spaces as well. And we thought, hey, why not create something like Terraform, right? That lets you spins, environments up anywhere, but obviously like focused on this dev container JSON and this reproducible dev environments. And we looked around that there wasn't really a solution for this. And we're like, someone's got to implement this standard in a Terraform-like fashion. So we just did that.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, in my opinion, Loft has a habit of producing or cooking and baking out some interesting tools. So this is the new one. Fresh from the kitchen, which is great. And tell us a little bit more about the history behind it and the inspiration and why you actually saw this as something that would be useful for the developer community.
Yeah, I think generally, with all the AI and ML and microservices coming up, it's just not the world anymore where your local laptop is enough for anything you need to do. A lot of applications are really tied to the cloud provider, use specific, like a ML framework or, with AI stuff coming up now, even more so. And, sometimes you just got to switch over to a VM or to a container that runs in the cloud to connect to the services locally better, to have GPUs available to run things on. And I think that we see that more and more that people have this demand of, switching between local and remote environments. So it's really important to build something that allows you that switching back and forth to different environments. And that's what we were really seeing as a missed opportunity right now, even for ourselves. As you know, they're like really deep down in Kubernetes, right? So this is like really complicated stuff we're working on as well. Lots of different services as well, and you just we gotta test things in different cloud providers, and it's just a pain for our own development right now to not be able to do that very easily. And now we can, and that's great. And hopefully it will be helpful not just for us, but for a lot of other people out there.
Yeah, and I mean, along with all of that, there might be times where you don't need those things, right? There might be times where your local Docker instance is fine, and that's all you need, and you can run that for free.
Yeah, I think that was really important.
Yeah, and simplicity is always welcome, right?
And remote.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think that all of us on this call have been around software development for a while, right? And I mean, I remember starting out in the days where, you know, a new engineer would show up and they would go to the wiki page, you know, and read like the 5 pages worth of instructions for like getting their dev environment set up. And like maybe a week later, they'd have a working laptop, you know. And I think that we're past the point where you know, companies can wait around for people to do that sort of thing, and also for, you know, engineers to tolerate it. You know, they just want to get their work done. They don't want to be messing around with you know, their local environment all the time, you know.
Yeah. Rich, you must have had it pretty good if you had to wait a week. I'm pretty sure I remember it being a little longer for me.
I back in those days, I was like the ops guy working with a bunch of engineers, a bunch of Java engineers. And yeah, I'm sure at times it was more than a week. It was pretty brutal watching these people run like 10 different microservices on their laptops.
Yep. And so this is actually somewhat similar, well, at least in naming, to DevSpace. So for people who are brand new to DevPod, they might be thinking, okay, is there overlap here? How do these two play together? Are they in the same space or domain? How do we differentiate them? What does that mean for our workflow? Is this just DevSpace part 2? So how about providing some clarity around that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, we get this quite a bit going out with the DevPod name. Yeah, we're not super creative in naming things. You know, like vCluster was the closest thing to virtual clusters we came up with, and we already knew DevSpace, so like DevPod wasn't far off. And we're like, space. Okay, what else do we know? Well, pods, right? We work in a Kubernetes space. But yeah, I think the you know, DevSpace and DevPod have a teeny overlap, but they're actually much more complementary than people think at first sight. Because when you're thinking about what does DevSpace do, right? DevSpace really is like a compose file, right? It like lets you define, oh, those are my 3 microservices. You know, I need these 2 microservices from this, you know, other Git repository. And if you run DevSpace dev, it essentially deploys them to a target Kubernetes cluster and then connects you to these pods and does hot reloading and stuff like that. But what it doesn't solve is, how do I start my IDE, and how do I get that linter and that, you know, debugger and like all of these things installed on my local machine and get that environment ready? How do we agree on the same Go version and like all of these things? Like that's things you can obviously put in a container, and people have asked us, hey, can't you do like a tunneling connection, something that like DevSpace directly like doesn't sync the files, but actually shows you the files right from the container, connects to your SSH. And we implemented some features in that direction, but it felt kind of, you know, out of scope for DevSpace. Additionally, DevSpace is purely focused on Kubernetes as a target environment. When you have Docker Compose as a tool to work with, and you want to work with just a Docker daemon instead of with a Kubernetes cluster, you're out of luck with DevSpace. That's not supported, right? Or if you want to work on functions, or as I said, a lot of this AI workloads, right, don't necessarily need to run in Kubernetes. They may also, you know, run on containers, but not necessarily in Kubernetes. And we thought, can't we build something that can be put under DevSpace to fix this IDE standardization, getting your environment ready, so that you can then use DevSpace inside of it. But instead of just DevSpace, you can also use Compose inside of it, or any kind of like dev tool that you're using for your serverless applications, right? Like there could be a lot of different tools you lay on top. So the idea is kind of, you fire up DevPod, and in your dev environment, you fire up your dev tool that actually, you know, does the deployment, etc.
Yeah. Great. So it's more of a foundational layer, essentially. compared to what
Pretty much.
DevSpace is. And it's not exclusive to Kubernetes development workflows. You could use it in other development workflows as well outside of cloud native applications.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right, great. That's interesting. So how about we actually delve into more of the details of it, and you could walk us through that. And I'm sure more questions will come up as we go through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to share a couple of slides or just dive into it like this? I can.
Either one is fine.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, essentially, the goal with DevPod was we looked at, obviously we're big GitHub fans, and we're using GitHub for pretty much anything. We're doing actions, obviously, as a Git repository, issues, right? As an open source maintainer, I think you're pretty much living in GitHub, right? So when we were facing these issues, the first thing we turned to was obviously code spaces, right? Which also created this Dev container standard. And I think Codespace is a really amazing solution. It's really quick to spin up things if you're on GitHub like we are. But we thought, hey, for an open source project, like not everybody is on GitHub or wants to, necessarily spend dollars on effectively Azure under the hood, I assume. And, it's obviously very expensive. It's very hard to kind of move to your local cloud provider with this. And it's obviously not open source. Like we saw, a lot of these concerns in code spaces. So we're essentially, how about we create something like code spaces, but make it open source, of course, make it client only as well, because obviously Codespace is a hosted offering, a SaaS kind of solution, right? You can't just run it on your own in your home lab or in your own infra, or just like Minikube or like regular Kubernetes, right? The power of open source is often I can run it wherever, right? How can we make it client only? So you make it very lightweight, so you don't necessarily need first to install like a heavyweight server and then connect to it, right? Like, can we just have like a simple CLI and then maybe like a nice UI layered on top of it? And then how can we make it as unopinionated as possible to allow people to deploy it wherever they want, in whatever shape and form they want, right? That was kind of the three. That's where I like to pull up the slide, because it really shows like when we thought about what's missing here, like what do we want to work on? That's the three kind of design principles we came up with of like, hey, this is what a perfect tool would look like for us, right? So let's go ahead and think about how we can build this. Yeah, and the result is DevPod, right? It ships as a desktop application, so very, very lightweight application, and every button you click and everything you do in the desktop UI is effectively a CLI command. So there's obviously also a CLI for it. It's very programmable, but we obviously didn't want people to manage their dev environments purely with the CLI, right? Sometimes like there's an IDE, it's easier to, yes, Vim works, right? And it's great. You may want something, nicer where you can install plugins and manage things easier, get a better overview. So you got to need something more powerful on top. And then the basic concept in DevPod that we're using is workspaces. So these workspaces, that is your actual dev environment. And they always are essentially containers. But these containers you don't need a Kubernetes cluster to connect to or something like that, because DevPod also has another concept called providers, which essentially allows you, and I think I have that here, allows you to say, where do I want this container to be spun up? Do I want it in my local Docker, right? This would be the most trivial provider. Do I want to connect the Kubernetes cluster? Do I want to SSH into an existing VM somewhere? Or do I want to provision a VM somewhere and then, stand up this dev container? But ultimately, that's how we can standardize things across any of these environments. We're always launching a container. So you can give us an image or a Docker file or even a Docker Compose file. And then we spin up these containers in any of these environments and then connect your IDE to it. And I think I also have, this is kind of the full picture of how things are connected. So there's this dev container that has a little agent in it, and then DevPod essentially establishes a remote SSH connection between your local IDE And this container that can, again, run in a VM, run in Kubernetes, run on your local machine, can run pretty much anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Lucas mentioned Terraform earlier. You know, that's sort of the same concept with the providers, right? And so there's a provider for each of these things, like local Docker, Kubernetes,
Right.
AWS, and you can choose which provider you want to use. And like Lucas was saying, you can even switch, right? So you can have a project that mainly uses one provider, but then you can launch it on a different one, you know, and on an ad hoc basis, like say that you need more horsepower or less, you know, than you normally do, whatever the situation is.
Yeah. And can you create custom providers?
Yeah, that's the beauty of the provider concept. So,
Great.
you know, a provider is essentially just a provider YAML file, right? We're Kubernetes folks, so obviously the YAML file. I'm sure we'll support other standards in the future as well. But like, you create this provider YAML file, and you can host it in a Git repository or in a static web server, or wherever you put it, and it essentially, in the easiest case, it just defines some bash commands, like what should be run when you need a VM provisioned. How should a VM be stopped? How can a VM be disposed of? And that's what a provider essentially tells DevPod which commands to run. And obviously, if you want a little bit more deeper integrated provider that works on like any kind of platform, you don't necessarily just put bash commands there, because like they may not run as well on Windows and stuff like that. You can obviously also write a little Golang CLI or whatever it may be, right? You can write a provider in any language, and then essentially in the provider YAML point at your CLI, and then essentially DevPod will automatically retrieve your CLI and execute these commands with your CLI. You can specify which to download for which operating system and stuff like that. And yeah, we've already seen people create providers. I think, Rich, you're in touch with a couple of folks, and it's only been 4 weeks or so since we launched DevPod.
Yeah, right? That's one of the really cool things, you know, is that when we released it originally, there were providers for, the major cloud providers, and, we had a few others there as well. And of course, the local Docker and Kubernetes and SSH that Lucas mentioned. But yeah, we've already seen, at least a couple people contribute ones for some other cloud provider in Europe that we didn't really know about that they're using, and it's super cool. And I think that that is really kind of what we're hoping to see, and maybe even see more of it, is people, being able to run these dev containers wherever it's most convenient for them.
And I think this kind of traces all the way back to keeping things unopinionated, right? Because that gives the project this flexibility and versatility for all sorts of, setups or contexts in different teams, because it's going to look different. And then from that, you get the kind of response that you're seeing already, the kind of contributions and the variety of different providers that are being created.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally blown away by that reaction. Like you see, obviously, kind of we looked at Terraform in that sense as a prime example. Like they use that provider concept, and I think, obviously that's a super vibrant community. So many different providers have been created for Terraform. And but what we did not, like, I thought it would take like months and months, not even like maybe even a year or so, till we see the first couple of providers pop up. We saw 5 being created, and where people reached out and said like, hey, can you put this in the README? And like, and I think that's just really cool to see. That reaction was amazing, that people are like, hey, my favorite, or like there's this local hoster that would be much easier for me and convenient, and I'm using it for my side projects, right? At work I use AWS, but like for my side projects, I want to work with them. Hey, let me write a provider for that. It's just amazing that people are already doing this.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more about the fact that you can define these environments as code. What was some of the reasoning behind that? I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of this. And if you could also touch on how that impacts standardization. I'm thinking even back to what Rich said earlier, previously, and well, I'm sure for a number of teams today, onboarding developers could take weeks or longer for some. So how does this impact standardization, accelerating the process of getting an environment running for developers and scaling teams?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the standardization part is super important. That's where this dev container JSON file comes in. I think one thing we even do in the getting started guide and in the product when you open it is we tell you, hey, just use this. Like Microsoft created these example projects for each language, right? So you can try them out with code spaces. And we thought about, hey, should we create example projects for this? And then we thought, no, let's just use these existing ones and show people, hey, you can start using DevPod, right? Without having to change anything, right? You just provide the Git URL and DevPod will spin that up. I mean, obviously you have to connect the provider, right? If you want to use AWS, you got to give it AWS credentials or have the CLI locally installed and be authenticated with it. But then with one click, you add that AWS provider, choose your region, and then you give it that GitHub URL to this sample project for GitHub code spaces. And boom, you have the IDE opening up, connected to a EC2 instance where your dev environment is running. And I think that really contributes to that magic of DevPod that we've seen and why it has like spiked so crazy in terms of popularity in just 4 weeks, because it's easy, right? You can adopt it with something that's potentially already in your organization. And we really believe that the dev container JSON standard that Microsoft's created is going to be the future, because Microsoft's pushing it with GitHub, right? Which is like a big reason, right? They're going to make it so easy on GitHub with one click to add this dev container JSON. I think they already have that where you can set it up for your GitHub projects with a couple of clicks. That's just so such a big reason that ease of use to get it set up and get started with it. But it's also a good specification, right? I mean, you can look at it here and it's just easy to understand, right? Obviously, I would rather prefer it to be dev container YAML, right? We can probably make that work.
You can use JSON Kubernetes too.
Yeah, there's so many quotes and brackets. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting when you mentioned the benefits of it being code. One thing that we've talked a lot about internally with, several of our tools is like that power of having your dev environment defined, in code. And, just as, again, I'm more of an infrastructure person. I went through years of the infrastructure as code thing, right? And there were a lot of lessons that we learned doing that, and some of the lessons were that it makes onboarding easier, right? Because the document is right there. Anyone can look at this file and see exactly what's going on. And so people are able to a lot of times answer their own questions just by looking at the file, or the other thing about it, well, a few more things that makes it very repeatable, right? The fact that you're all working off the same file. And then one thing that I think is really great when it comes to things like this is that, this file is getting exercised all the time, right? That like it's constantly being used. So it's not like finding some page in your Confluence, or whatever your wiki is, and like looking at the date to see that it's 2 years old and wondering if those instructions are still going to work or not. This thing is getting used like daily. And so it's going to be current, it's going to be up to date. And I think that all of those things are really, really big benefits to using these sort of, dev workflow as code tools or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, that's great. So let's say there's someone tuning into this right now, or maybe they're going to watch it later, and they're thinking, we definitely want to implement this in our team and probably even across the organization eventually. But how do we standardize on certain quality control? And I think there's an opportunity there because this is defined as code. So are there any tips that you can give in terms of adopting it into a workflow, but making sure that there's still quality control applied to it? Any tips on hygiene, or perhaps even aligning or complying with internal policies? What should teams be thinking about around that?
I mean, step one is definitely, this is a file that does not belong on your Git ignore. I know sometimes, if something's new, people are like, don't check it in first, right? But this is a file you do want to have in your Git repository, right? You want to version it. You want to make sure that people contribute to it, right? Because ultimately it's about bundling also like best practices, right? You see that down here in this like example. I know it's a little small, but you see down here like post create command, right? Which essentially runs a pip install for this particular, Python workspace. And that is something that, updating your dependencies every time you connect to this environment is probably a good idea, right? And someone put that in the file for a reason. And there may be other things like, like essentially shutting it down the right way, in even codifying some commands that are executable within the environment, adding some aliases, right, to the terminal to just execute things quicker. I think all these things can contribute to a better experience, so that people start these environments and immediately have their tooling handy to see what they can do. And I think one of the biggest things that we also learned with DevSpace is sometimes a very easy, instead of starting the terminal with the simple bash command, or like essentially having in your bash RC or whatever, have like an output specified that shows up and essentially shows you, hey, welcome, you're in your workspace. Here are the 5 most common commands. This is how you're starting the application. Right. This is how you're starting the debug mode, right? Adding that kind of stuff will really make it easier for people to launch this, because they literally install DevPod as a tool and then put in the Git repository, and then it fires up that environment, and then they open the terminal, and the terminal immediately tells you, hey, this is what you can do here, right? It's very straightforward. Obviously, you can achieve similar things with a README, and people also can look in this file. And I think the more like browser extensions in VS Code and the IntelliJ suite, the JetBrains suite get better. They may even expose these commands, right? And actually show you, hey, this is what's defined as file as a post create command, re-execute it, or something like that. So I think there's a lot of stuff still to come.
Great. Yeah, and again, in terms of the benefits of it being code, whenever stuff changes, right, you've got that opportunity for code review, for conversations on the pull request. Like, great, you want to make this change. Is this something that we've thought through? Is it really the right way? Is there maybe a better way to do this? What you're trying to accomplish? There's all those kinds of things that can be done. When this stuff is code.
Yep. And how important is it for developers to be able to have a portable developer environment, something that they can have locally and recreate in a cloud environment, and perhaps even share with others, especially when it comes to things like integration testing?
I think it's pretty essential. I think people are not going to get around it in the future anymore. Some of our early customers for the DevSpace story combined with Loft as a commercial product, where around, hey, if we really want to run this test, I got to push it to CI, right? CI is going to run these tests. And then 30 minutes later, I know, right, does the integration test fail or not? And I'm like, yeah, that may not be the best experience, right? And the best use of obviously, obviously great for the cloud providers in terms of running up the build to run these CI pipelines, but that's not what a company wants to achieve here. I think giving people the control to go in and say, like, I'm going to run this integration test, or I'm going to run this specific test, right? Not the entire test suite, which, obviously your CI runs the whole thing and may take 20 minutes or more, right? Versus you made one change and exactly, I need to run this test to be sure. Obviously, before I merge it, my pull request is going to run through the entire suite, right? But while I make quick changes, I may run this one test that needs 30 seconds or a minute to run to just verify certain things. And that just becomes so much easier if you're in the production-like environment, right? Because you are in AWS here, you're in Kubernetes, right? You're wherever your production can run as well. And you have all the cloud power of the world that you can connect to here. And that's really, really helpful for running these end-to-end or larger integration tests.
Yeah, it's like having tethered autonomy. You can quickly move where you need to do what you have to in a, like you said, production-like environment, and then get right back into your environment. And I imagine this is so important even in teams. For example, if developer A Bob, for example, is running into issues. He's tried it out locally, ports it to a production-like environment. It's not working out. And if you think about the amount of time it would take for someone else, like a teammate, to recreate that environment, now all of a sudden with DevPod, it's kind of like, hey, share your environment with me, and I debug it on that end. Or perhaps merging or simply inviting to a DevPod. Is that something that's possible? And say, hey, this is what spun up. Can you, can you invite me into that space and I help you with debugging that?
Yeah, you're asking some interesting questions. It is possible today. It's not as trivial as it could be. So that's definitely something we want to simplify. So right now, if you're spinning up like a AWS EC2 instance, right, with DevPod, obviously other people can access it because it's in your EC2, right? But it's not out of the box in the sense that you can have like a shareable link or something like that, right? But we want to get to that point. So right now it essentially requires both parties to be authenticated with AWS in, essentially to, for the one person, they may use the AWS provider to create that environment, and the other person could use the SSH provider to just, SSH connect to that very same instance. But again, like there are a lot of thoughts on our end on how we can simplify that process and really make it, like you said, like, hey, send someone, like I do like a DevPod share, right? And then it spits out a little command, and I send that command to someone else, and they just run that command to get going. I think that's ultimately where we want to end up with this as well.
But these things that we're talking about, like, to me, this stuff is the real promise of containers, right? Like when you think about when Docker started off, that was the whole idea, is that you've got this artifact, and it's got all your dependencies in it and everything that you need. And it really hasn't been that way in reality for a lot of people, And so I think especially when it comes, to development, that it's super powerful to be able to have that one image that's, has got everything that you're going to need to do your job.
Right. So just before we dive into a demo, I have to ask the most important question that will be asked in this episode. Where's my t-shirt? I'm feeling that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. See, Rich, you're trying to hide it. You're trying to hide it. Think I can't see it, but Lucas is flexing with it. He keeps leaning back.
We will get you a t-shirt, my friend. We'll make that happen.
Great. All right, Lucas, do you want to show us DevPod in action with a demo?
Yeah, for sure. Let me dive right in. So obviously I have it already installed. I don't have a workspace right here. Oh, is the screen shared or not? Sorry, I forgot to.
I'm not seeing it right now.
There we go.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to check if I had shared it. Okay, perfect. I have the desktop app running. We don't have a workspace yet. What I already did is I connected the AWS provider, which essentially just means you have to have AWS CLI installed. You can also give it like service account credentials, etc. instead. But we typically recommend, like, for your local flow, just, sign in via the CLI, do your SSO, whatever it is, right? And then if you can, from there, theoretically create an EC2 instance or connect to one, right, you should be good to go. But there's more things you can configure in these providers. Like you can obviously specify the region where your environments are spun up. You can say which instance type to use for these environments. In a couple of other things, like when does your environment go to sleep automatically when you're not using it. And what's important to understand here is when we're talking about a provider like AWS, it typically provisions an EC2 instance of VM, right? And this VM, and that's a checkbox down here, can be reused for multiple of your workspaces. So as we heard earlier, right, a workspace is essentially a container or even a set of containers if you're using Docker Compose that represent your dev environment that you connect your IDE to. But where's the underlying infra, right? And the provider creates that infra. If we uncheck this box here, it would essentially always create a VM and then create a new container inside of it. But in a lot of cases, that doesn't make sense for you, because let's say you're working on 2 different projects, right? You probably want to have 2 different workspaces for that, because obviously there are different Git repositories. They may have a different language or framework, right? But you can run 2 containers on the same VM. And because these workspaces go to sleep when you're not using them, right? So that one of container you worked with 10 minutes ago may just shut down, and then you work on another project, and then that container is the one that's just running. And then after a certain timeout of none of the actual containers being used, the entire VM would also stop in the background. You said that earlier as well, like cost is something they focus on a lot with these environments, that's a factor. And that's definitely important here. So we build in this like timeout feature for workspaces and for these VMs right from the start. Obviously, when you click on add provider here, you can add a whole bunch of other providers as well. You could even add another AWS provider, just give it a different name. Let's say you have a company account and a personal account, scenarios like this, or you have different cloud accounts within the company that you need to connect to, or it's like sub accounts.
So many companies have multiple AWS accounts.
Yeah.
I think that's like standard operating procedure.
I think so too. Is that's the AWS best practice, right? Like every business unit gets an account or something like that, or even every team or something.
Yeah, it's one of the setups, having multiple organization units.
Yeah, I think that's pretty standard for a lot of folks. Obviously you can connect Kubernetes here, whether you have like a local Minikube running on Docker desktop or any kind of remote Kubernetes cluster. Everything you need is a local kube config, right? So if you can run kubectl get pods, you can run DevPod with this as well. Obviously local Docker, SSHing into a machine, whole bunch of other cloud providers. And then what you can also do is you can add custom here, which allows you to just put in the source repository. Typically, it's like a GitHub repo. So you just need the org name / the repo name. And then it would pull that provider YAML from the net and essentially give you the config options, because the provider YAML defines what can I configure, right? Like if we look at the AWS provider, like obviously this needs a different name, right? Because like this could be, for example, my company account instead of my personal one, because I already got one connected. And then it's loading now, because now it's loading the provider YAML, and then it will show you all the options that are configurable for that particular provider. And that's the ones we already saw earlier, right, in the settings page, which region, which instance, which profile, etc. And that's how you add a provider. And then once you have a provider set up, you obviously need at least one to do something, right? I got the AWS one. Then you can create a workspace. And when you first install the product, it's gonna walk you through nicely. Hey, let's add a provider first. Which one do you have credentials for? And then it's gonna show you the workspaces. So you don't need to click through like I did right now. And then we're in this view to actually create a workspace. You can see there's 2 main options on the bottom, which provider to use. And from here, you can also launch the add provider view that we had open earlier, where you can add new ones. And then you can choose your IDE. I have VS Code installed, so that's my default option. You can also set a default here under settings. That one is the one you always launch your environments with. You can also set different projects to open with different IDEs, right? It's very configurable. You can use VS Code in the browser, which would just launch it in your browser. That's kind of the fallback option if you don't have an IDE installed. Let's say, like you're on the go and I don't know, it's like the servers start burning at work, and you got to quickly borrow your wife's laptop or whatever and do something, right? Download DevPod, click on VS Code browser, you can start working. And then the most important thing is up here, where you're essentially telling us which Git repository. You can also select a local folder if you already have Git cloned the project. Obviously, you don't need to have it locally, because we're creating this VM and then this container, or like just a container in Kubernetes, or just a container in your SSH connected machine. And then we're Git cloning the project there anyway. So you don't need it locally. But if you have it locally, because you've been previously working with that, that's an option as well. On the right-hand side, that's really handy for this demo, so I don't need to copy-paste some stuff. We have some sample projects that just essentially fill out this field here. So, and that's the example.
You mentioned this. You mentioned this earlier, but this was one of my favorite things when I started playing with it, was the fact that we didn't even touch these projects. Right, these are straight off of Microsoft's GitHub repo and repos, and I think that that's super powerful. That, like, hopefully as time goes on, we'll see a lot more repositories start getting these devcontainer.json files added to them. And then, people will have the option to use them with either one, right? Like, you could use it with Codespaces or DevPod, or, whatever tool that you want to use that supports that standard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really cool to be able to just use any of these repos. You see here, this regular Microsoft, their Python, try VS Code with Codespace as example. And I think, there is, to what you're saying, Rich, like switching back and forth is really, really cool. Because, for example, one thing that DevPod can't do right now is when you open a PR and you want to have a preview environment created, right? DevPod, I guess, could spin it up for you, but it's not super ideal. But what GitHub is really great at with Codespace, and I assume like GitLab and Bitbucket, they probably have alternatives for this as well. They can essentially spin up based on this dev container JSON environment, and then you click a link and immediately you have the ID in the browser without even downloading anything. So for like a quick PR review, or you want to, debug something because the end-to-end test failed, and it's just a minor thing you want to edit here, that may actually be preferable. But if you really want to develop the project, and you would typically git clone it locally and don't want to work in the browser, something like DevPod is essentially going to give you the flexibility for any kind of environment. So yeah, let's launch one of these environments. We picked the AWS provider. We picked VS Code as an IDE. I just picked this Python project, or any wishes regarding programming language. Can switch to JavaScript if that's more favorable. All right, I think we're good.
We can stick with Python. So beyond just selecting a default IDE, if I install any extensions, for example, in my VS Code instance, are all those saved as part of the pod?
Yeah, that's really a good question. So you can see that here in this example I showed up earlier. So that in the dev container JSON, there is a section called customizations, and then a subsection called VS Code. But I guess you could, define other IDEs or even other tools that need to be configured, right? You can even potentially say, hey, I want this like kubectl, behavior changed or color scheme, or always put it out as a JSON instead of YAML. Then you can define settings here. And for VS Code, it has this extensions setting here, where you can see, hey, this is a code spelling tool that I always want to have installed, or a linter, or a formatting tool, right? Like there's so many things that you can configure as extensions. And then because that is configured in your dev container JSON, we can essentially launch your VS Code with these extensions pre-configured. So your environment will have them ready to go for you as soon as the environment pops up.
And that's the same for the web-based VS Code too, which is really cool. So you could make sure that, even if you have to pop in through the web browser for some reason, that the extensions you need are always going to be there.
Yep.
Yeah.
The color theme is obviously the most important thing here. Right? we could care less about the other things.
You'll be surprised. One of the first requests was actually, can there be, and you see I'm not using dark mode, right? So I'm already getting the flame in the comments, I guess. But yeah, I think one of the first questions that came up when we started talking about, hey, this is like standardizable in the dev container JSON, was like, what if I want to customize it like as an individual, like I really want dark mode, right? I want to pick the theme for myself, right? And I think that is something we're working on right now. So one thing we're working on is that you can essentially, in your home directory, where you have like a lot of these like dot files that configure things specifically for you, right? And in your VS Code settings and like, wherever these files are located, that you're essentially in the DevPod settings here, we're going to add a section where you can tell us, hey, please copy this and this and this file, which specifies my override preferences, so that you can enable dark mode for you specifically, but still get the benefit of all the other standardized, features that your company has put in the dev container JSON.
Right. And this is so important because teams don't just standardize on a particular language. I mean, sure, you have teams where it's like a heterogeneous kind of setup. It's, pick the specific technology that is most suitable for a service that's being developed. But there are also lots of situations where teams say we've standardized on this particular language or this particular framework, but then it goes a level beyond that. They will standardize on certain tools, whether it's a specific linter. So I think this is so important because then now you don't have to worry about, here's the list of things that you need to install. Going back to Rich's point earlier. And again, it's bringing back some hard memories for me here, Rich. I'm remembering what it was like. And like I said, it took more than a week for me. So, but again, now all of this is defined in this standard configuration file, and it makes it easy for other people to create an instance of that particular environment, and they get up and running real quick. Lowers the barrier of entry, right?
Yeah. I mean, we talked a whole bunch in the meantime, but like VS Code already popped up here, and that took maybe like a minute or two. Like, obviously we can't reduce the time to, provision an EC2 instance. Your second environment though is going to spin up a lot quicker because that EC2 instance, as I said, is already there, and we're just launching a container. So it's really image pull and then opening up your IDE and configuring these extensions, which is fairly quick. And then the hint that you see is at the left bottom corner that you're actually using, VS Code remote try Python was the name of our project, and then .devpod, which is our SSH host name that we're connecting to. So all the files I'm seeing here, then my remote environment, right? You see that here on the left as well. Like, this is via SSH shown, this file tree, and not on my local machine. And now I can like make edits to these files here in my IDE. I can obviously open the terminal and run commands here. And you can see I'm in that remote environment. I'm not on my local machine. And that also helps to kind of bridge the differences in operating systems, etc., right? Because we're essentially, your entire environment and everything you do happens in a container. And that container can run anywhere. And that's really, really the power of this.
Yeah, and we do support, some of those other IDEs like the JetBrains ones, but like, I don't think there's any debate at this point that VS Code has just won, right? There was a period of time when it first came out where there were a few different ones that people would pick between, but it's so powerful and really works well. And so I think it was such a smart idea to standardize on that devcontainer.json and get that SSH support for free.
Yeah, if you do want to launch another IDE, right, you see here VS Code is the default one you configured. You can have multiple environments that have different IDEs configured, but you can also on the fly click here and then say start with, and then you open it in the browser or you open it with Golang, for example. So you can easily switch back and forth between these environments. And when I open this context menu, there's also a couple of interesting things here to see. Share configuration to essentially, tell other people, hey, this is the get going. Rebuilding the environment, so saying, hey, please clear that container and the persistent volume, right? Like, let's nuke this and set it up clean. Stopping the environment, as I said earlier, that happens automatically after a couple minutes timeout. So right now we're in a SSH session, and as long as that SSH session is valid, it will obviously not kick us out. But as soon as I close VS Code here locally, the timeout is going to kick in. And I think we can see that in the provider. We've configured a 3-minute timeout. So after 3 minutes,
this goes back to
this goes to sleep.
Right, the inactivity setting.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can also obviously manually click the stop button to stop the environment instead of waiting for the timeout. And when it's sleeping, it's going to show the status here that it's essentially paused. And then when you click on open, it just restarts that container or even the VM, right? Like, it's first like, let's say you have 3 projects in the same VM. it essentially would set a timeout for each one of the workspaces. And when all of the workspaces are paused, then the timeout starts for the VM itself. And then when that timeout is hit, the VM actually gets shut down as well.
Okay. Yep, I think that's super important to know. I know that that's something that comes up often, especially for trying to have production-like developer environments. Teams want to know, okay, how do we shut down things so they don't just keep running, because that's going to incur more costs. So I think that's really important for people to understand as well.
Yeah, the biggest thing in IT, like when you talk to IT folks instead of the engineering teams, right? You ask them, what's one of your biggest concerns? They're like, yeah, these engineers, every time I'm asking, like, do you still need this? They're like, yeah. Don't do not stop this, do not delete this, right? So kind of having an automatic way of like easily, pausing and resuming these environments baked in is really going to ease some of that, I guess, conflict potential between IT and engineering.
Absolutely. Yeah. By the way, Rich, I'm glad that you spoke so well of VS Code. I just want you to know that I've got a couple of friends that I've been debating for years about VS Code versus a couple of other IDEs. So I'm just going to play that back on loop several times for them and say, hey, you can watch this video. Definitely download DevPod, but I want you to focus on this specific
Send them the link to that
the live stream. Yeah.
Place. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because I'm so old school, and I was definitely one of those Vim people, for many, many years, and I still have Vim installed, and I'll still use it sometimes on a whim, yeah, I'm much more likely to use VS Code even for things like editing Markdown or something like that. It's just it's so nice.
Yeah. What's some of the most exciting initial feedback that you've received?
I think people just creating providers. That was the most amazing thing to see. And I think all these ideas, like you said as well, in terms of like how can we share this, to make like team collaboration even better. And there are so many things in that direction. I mean, there's so much feedback in these initial 4 weeks. It's crazy. I think that's what I really love. Like when sometimes VCs and other people ask you about like, hey, why do you put stuff in open source? Like obviously, don't we want to make money with this company, right? And I'm like, yeah, sure, but what we really get from open source, and they ask like, is it because like engineering team and like people writing code for free and stuff like that? And I'm like, no, not really. I think what's really great about open source is that open exchange of ideas, right? People see something, they can go into the code and see like, how is it really done, right? And then they can say, hey, how about we would add this here and like change it in this direction? That feedback loop is super quick. If I'm in some SaaS product, there may not even a feedback button, right? I don't even know. Like maybe I can open that chat button down there, but where does that end up? Does the product manager even look at this, or does an engineer ever get to see what I'm writing in that support chat? The open source is pretty clear. You go to GitHub, you open an issue, the maintainer is going to look at it, right? And that's just really, really great. Oh, we just like it went to sleep as well. Like you saw busy here. And it's going to turn to paused in just a second. Busy in this case means like it's doing something, which I assume is like it's actually putting it to sleep.
Yeah, I think too, besides anything specific, we've just been blown away by the overall level of enthusiasm for this project. I think that we knew that it had a lot of potential. Like we knew that there's potentially a very big audience out there. Like I assumed that there would be a lot of people out there who would love to use something like code spaces without having to pay for it, right? Whether it's like working on a side project or working at a company that's got a very tight budget, which I'm sure a lot do right now. And the code spaces licensing, it's like based on that number of hours thing. And it's like, it's not really enough hours for somebody who's developing full time, for an entire month. And so my assumption was that there would be a lot of people who were excited about this, but it's exceeded our expectations. We've just been blown away by all the people who are embracing this thing. And like Lucas said, giving us really valuable feedback too.
Yeah, I've heard some people tell us that they were looking at the cost of code spaces and it wasn't really viable for them. And then they looked at what we're doing here. And I think when you look at it from a cost perspective, right, this is just the EC2 instance, right? And as I said, it's stopped right now, right? So you can literally go into into the AWS UI, and you see it's a stopped instance, right? And as soon as I hit this open button, it's just going to fire up that AWS instance, and we print all the commands here as well, so you know exactly what's happening. So if I refresh this here, you see this instance is running, and now we're spinning up this container again, and we're launching VS Code at the end again, right? It's very straightforward for you to get into these environments. When you look at it from a cost perspective, obviously this pausing is great, but if you're comparing a managed service or a SaaS kind of offering to like a bare EC2 instance, like obviously the EC2 instance is going to be cheaper. Some folks have told us like it depends a little bit on like how beefy your machines should be and what you're comparing. You may not even have like GPUs available in code spaces, and now you do, right? And some folks have told us like the cost factor is really like 3 to 10x cheaper by using DevPod with bare AWS or DevPod with their own local cloud provider for certain things. And you can switch back and forth, right? You can say, hey, for something less mission critical, I'm using this thing. For if local is good enough, I'm using the Docker provider or something like Minikube to stand up my containers. And then if I want to run my end-to-end tests and really test things or debug this end-to-end tests or do something more advanced, then I'm switching over to an EC2 instance or to a remote EKS cluster or something like that. I think people have really explored these flexibilities, and that's really cool to see people just start putting it everywhere. I think we had after 4 weeks we had over 5,000 active users, and that was just like insane to me to see. Like we have a couple thousand GitHub stars, and obviously that's always great as an interesting metric to look at. But like seeing that even more people actually got their hands on it and keep using it daily is just fantastic to see.
The flexibility is so cool too. What you were talking about, Lucas, like I always think about, when people talk about like the local development versus remote, one of those things that always comes up is, what happens when I get on a plane, right? Like if I can only do remote development and I've got an 8-hour flight and I want to get some work done, and in that case, you just switch over to your local Docker or Kubernetes or something and you do your work, right? And then later on, you can run those integration tests that need like some AWS service to be there, for them to run. And yeah, I think it's so cool to be able to meet people where they are, give them the options to like work the way that they want to work.
Yep. Yeah, it's an excellent bridge between local and remote development and making it possible for both, allowing you to switch context when you need to. But I'm also just thinking about how it's such a timely 1-2 punch, because given the economic climate right now, a lot of teams are trying to prioritize cost optimization models, but they're not trying to move backwards or regress when it comes to productivity. So this is kind of like essentially trying to give teams both, right? At least that's the way I see it. Going back to what you were pointing out, Lucas.
Great. Yeah, don't make a step backwards, right? Dev containers should be more of the future for you. Don't move back to like, hey, we're gonna go back to our Java EE monolith that we're running locally.
Yeah, you've always got those timeouts too, as sort of a guardrail, right? So like,
exactly,
you're not going to screw up too bad, right? You're not going to leave the thing running for days that you only needed for 10 minutes,
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, but I think that feature is really important. Single field, setting the inactivity, but it's so important. So I'm very, very keen to see more of the kind of feedback that you'll be getting.
It's actually something we learned from DevSpace, because that was one of the things that people were curious in DevSpace as well. And we solved it very well in our commercial product Loft, because on the server side, you can monitor things easily, but obviously having timeouts and stuff like that on the client side for open source to like DevSpace is preferable. So we also added a solution there, but it had all kinds of problems. Like, what if I just close my laptop right now? Like that client tool, like what's it going to do, right? If that remote environment is running. So we did actually something really smart in DevPod. And let me go quickly to that architecture I showed earlier here. So yeah, there we go. So I think the the interesting piece is, so we have all these providers that provision our core environment, right? Like a EC2 machine, and then we install the DevPod agent there, and then we have the dev container, and we have the agent again inside the container. That's where you're connecting your IDE to. But this one is really important because this agent monitors the connections inside the dev container and to the actual machine, so it can literally see, is something going on in this machine? Right. And that means even if you're, if you throw your laptop out of the window and it loses connection and like nothing is working anymore, you're not relying on the desktop to pause the VM. The VM has an agent running, right? Has a daemon running that continuously says like, hey, am I still needed? If not, I'm going to turn myself off, right? Great. And I think that was a really interesting architectural decision. Looks like a small feature with that small input field, but there went a lot of thought in how to make that work in a smart way.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Just before we close off, any final thoughts or particular things that you want to share with our viewers and others who will eventually watch this?
Yeah, maybe two things. So there's some exciting stuff coming up very soon. I mean, apart from all the feature requests we've gotten from the community, I think the thing that's coming next up is really going to highlight all these community providers, because we want to definitely, right now you have to really explore them. And I don't want to take away too much of what we're announcing next week, but just to give you a glimpse at it right now, if you're adding a community provider, clicking here, and then you have to know where the URL is to find your provider, may not be as comfortable for a lot of people. And we really want to help people showcase their providers and really foster that community of folks that are writing these great providers. So that's something that we're currently looking into and have a release ready for next week. And then something else is going to come on our end as well to, like we said earlier, like there may be requirements to have a centralized management tool to supervise these things, add additional like compliance requirements that you asked about earlier. There may be something coming in that direction as well.
Oh, really neat. Don't steal your own thunder now, right? But man, that sounds really interesting. Looking forward to that. All right. Well, Rich, Lucas, thank you so much for your time. DevPod is certainly an exciting and cool tool, and I hope that it continues to only gain more traction here onwards, and that more people get involved in the project as well. That's the beauty of open source enhancement by collaboration from other brilliant minds around the world. So for everyone who is watching, thanks a lot for tuning in, depending on where you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night.
Thank you.